First of all, kia ora, talofa lava, and awa bakal. My name is Matthew Tukaki, and I'm head of the UNGC here in Australia, and I'll explain a few other roles as well in a minute to set some context and some scene. I want to acknowledge, though, the Indigenous people of this Canberra land and pay my respects to the elders and the ancestors, both past and present. Today is World Indigenous Peoples Day. For those of you who don't know that, it's a really important day for me personally because I'm also chairman of Australia's Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. And while I've sent Warren Mundine up to the Garamul Festival in Darwin and John Hewson is talking about Indigenous economic finance somewhere in Melbourne, it's really important that you understand that today is all about promoting Indigenous people taking leadership roles and participating in the biggest discussions and debates that are going on. The three languages I said hello in, the first was Indigenous, an Aboriginal language from the Kimberley. The second is my native Māori language from New Zealand. English is my second language, Māori is my first language, and of course, for those of you familiar with the Pacific Islands, talofa lava comes from the Pacific. We have an amazing opportunity too, just on Indigenous Peoples Day, to back constitutional recognition. I am not an appointed government official to the role within the UN that I hold. I'm an elected official, not appointed, so I can be a little bit crazy about the things I choose to advocate on and for. So if you have a chance to start conversations with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues and with your workmates about the need to empower our Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders right across this country, then I certainly advocate it, and I hope when the campaign for constitutional recognition comes up that you will get in behind it. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the UNAA for having me and also the Global Compact. We very rarely show our faces in public in Australia in a forum such as this, but it's recognition of the new partnerships that we're developing and have been developing over the last 12 and 24 months. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague Chris Woodthorpe and the wonderful work of UNIC. Chris wasn't kidding when he said that the UNIC are a small team covering such a wide and vast territory, and any support they can get I think would be absolutely welcome. They do a wonderful job. Just to set the scene for those of you who don't know who we are, the United Nations Global Compact is the business and industry side of the United Nations. So we have just over 7,500 signatories to the Global Compact who are companies and businesses. Some 300 of them hail from Australia and include our largest banks or institutions, our mining companies, small and medium-sized companies, organisations such as Woolworths and Rio Tinto, Worley Parsons, etc. There are 2,500 to 3,000 other signatories from the non-government and academic institution space, from universities and polytechnics to organisations such as Plan International and World Vision. Now, I'll tell you a brief story. The reason that we exist is we came into formation under the guise of Kofi Annan, who recognised that it was time for business and industry to play a much more active role when it comes to some of the biggest challenges that we face around the world. You cannot have sustainable development and you cannot have things such as sustainable peace unless business and industry have a role to play. And that's somewhat controversial in the minds of some people. But one of the interesting things I've heard in the discussion this morning, I've heard a lot of talk about civil and military collaboration in the context of failed and developing states. But what I haven't heard this morning is the business role and how we can affect a sustainable peace and sustainable development. And I'm going to touch on that because I think it's time for a bit of a paradigm shift. We are built on the premise of four core pillars: anti-corruption, the environment, human rights and labour. Each one of those four core pillars is about the Global Compact educating business and industry on the responsible role they need to and they must play, both locally in their own domestic economies, in the region and also globally if they're global players or multinationals. My role is somewhat different. I am an elected individual. I'm certainly not appointed by the Australian government. And my role within the Global Compact and within the UN system is also quite unique. Put some context around it, we were talking about elections this morning. I'm one of these characters, or you can call them creatures, although I hope I'm not a political one, that lobbied to be elected into the position. And to put it into context again, the Global Compact is split into 7 regions of the world, and we have 101 outposts around those 7 regions. We therefore have 101 representatives who represent business and industry from their countries. So I am very fortunate to be the elected head of the United Nations Global Compact in terms of being the representative voice for all 101 networks around the world, from Syria, Jordan and Cairo in the Middle East or Egypt, through to the South American networks into Eastern and Western Europe. I'm the first Australian to be appointed directly by the Secretary-General to a board such as the UNGC, and I'm going to be there for 3 years, so I figure I can make one hell of a difference over that period of time. The other interesting thing about me is I have control over our reform agenda, and what I'm currently going through at the moment in that reform agenda, and I head to the Middle East tomorrow, is to start building the capacity and the capability of all of our local networks around the world to begin guiding business and industry towards sustainable development objectives. The reason that that's so important is that 25 years ago, when Grove Brundtland first put sustainable development on the agenda in terms of linking social, economic and environmental pillars together, we came together in Rio last year, finally agreeing that yes, business did play an important role. And this might sound really crass, but in the greater scheme of things, when a business or a company crosses the border of another country, we don't call that an invasion, we call that investment. And with that investment comes the creation of jobs, comes the building of schools and community centres, education facilities, hospitals and medical centres. The key to it is ensuring that the companies, when they cross the border of a developing nation, obviously, sometimes, majority, with a commercial intent, that they're acting as good corporate citizens, and that's the role of the United Nations Global Compact. The pillars that we're built on, though, aren't just about anti-corruption. It's not just about the environment and human rights and labour. It's also about a periphery of other issue areas. And the reason we get involved in these areas is, again, because we believe business plays an important role. And here are just some other ones: women's empowerment, sustainable agriculture, Indigenous development, and also water security. There are 24 other issue areas that we deal with. In the context of women's empowerment, business and industry employ people. We can wait for governments to regulate equity when it comes to pay or regulation and enforcement, or what we can do as companies is sign up to the fact that it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you should be paid equally for the work that you do and the things that you contribute to. More importantly, women's empowerment is not just about what happens in a developed country context, it's also the immense ability that companies have, if they act responsibly and are open to this, of saying, well, okay, just because we're operating in Africa doesn't mean to say that if we have a mining operation or some kind of other manufacturing plant, that we just have to employ the local male population. The problem has been in the past that we focus all of our energy on skills and education development by employing local males because we believe that they're the only primary earner in a household. And that's just completely incorrect. So one of the focuses of a lot of Australian companies over the last 5 years in particular has to rethink how we engage with local communities and also how we can at the same time address the empowerment of women to earn a wage and not be reliant on anybody else, which I think is really important. Sustainable agriculture for us is also important because the world is reaching a population that will exceed 9 billion people. We have to find new ways of feeding a population that is going to grow, and quite honestly, one of the biggest development challenges that we currently have is that we are yet to address the issue of population. In order, though, to supplant or to supply a population, it needs to be a coordinated approach. And what we're doing at the moment with the Global Compact is developing in collaboration with civil society, with business and also with government, a series of global sustainable agricultural principles. And in the areas of Indigenous development and water security and business and children's rights, there are a whole range of other things that we're working on as well. So the primary role of the United Nations Global Compact is to educate and inform, monitor and evaluate, which is really important. Just because you say you're doing something, we want to make sure that you are in fact doing it. And every year, more than 7,500 of these signatories need to communicate on their progress and publish what they're doing up to public scrutiny. We also develop platforms for engagement, so we've realised that civil society is somewhat suspicious of the motivations of business and industry, and quite frankly, rightly so. It's our role to build platforms of dialogue and engagement to ensure that business and industry and civil society are no longer fighting with each other, but coming together in a form of collective impact. Our role is also to build consensus and execution around collective action. And this is where we have the ability to say, well, let's not just operate in isolation. Yes, you might be an industry and you might be all competitive in that industry, but let's start looking at ways of targeting aid or targeting business investment to certain projects to get a greater and faster impact. As an example, if you're a multinational mining company operating in Africa and there might be 4 Australian companies and 3 foreign companies operating in, say, Angola, and each one of the investments that they're making into the communities are separate and in isolation, well, that makes no sense at all. So there's a lot more sense now in bringing all of that investment together for a greater and faster collective impact. And by collective impact, I mean that we're not competing for skills development in the local community, that we're not overburdening the local population with facilities that aren't needed or required, and that we're planning things effectively where the community begins to take ownership of the very assets that we're building under what we call our corporate social licence to operate. What I do want to do, though, is I want to challenge this notion of development, which I think is the whole premise of the question. This morning we heard a lot about all of the different things that are going on when it comes to military and civil conflict. This diagram, for those of you who are at the back, you probably can't see it, if I can just describe it. There are 4 core pillars in what we see as being a paradigm shift to development. The first pillar is that normally what happens when a country requires a huge amount of development aid or assistance is that there's been some sort of intervention, a civil or military intervention. It might be because it's been brought about by direct state-to-state intervention, otherwise known as one country crossing the border of another. It might also be brought about by civil unrest, and we've seen that happen in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, or alternatively failed state implosion or recognition that it's time, as is the case with Myanmar, when the penny drops and you realise that you've actually got no other alternative. You've actually got to start down the path of democracy. And then the fourth is where we have a Security Council intervention, such as the case of what's happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. The challenge is that a lot of people don't see the role that business plays when it comes to an economy or a country that should be in recovery mode. And I put it as simply as this, and I'll be saying this in the Middle East when I get there in the next few days. The reality is that when a lot of people have idle time on their hands, they do create trouble. And that might be a very simplistic view of it, but that is also the truth. So the role of business and industry is also about helping a government or a nation state return to some kind of economic stability. The other thing that we've realised too in doing that, institutions need to be strengthened, and we heard a little bit about that this morning from some of the panels. And when we talk about institutional strengthening, there's also the realisation that many of the current institutions in a failed state are actually irrelevant. They are completely and utterly irrelevant. They were normally geared around one single person or one single party. So how we see infrastructure, how we see process, how we see regulation, or the formation of good governance within a civil society, the reality is those pillars do not exist in a failed state environment once the conflict has come to an end. Factions developed or had developed, and institutions are unfamiliar with multi-party structures. It's another thing that people fail to recognise. One of the challenges with Libya at the moment is that there are so many different factions still permeating across the country that it becomes hard to get a form of political stability. So one of the focuses that we encourage and advocate for is the strengthening of institutions. The third pillar, which follows quickly from that, is the ability to return an economy and introduce regulatory reform. And this is another pillar of what I call the development agenda being turned upside down a little bit. The reality is, if you have a look at a country like Myanmar, Myanmar's laws have been on the books since the 1920s. The labour laws have not been reformed since 1920, 21, 22. If you want to go and study law in Myanmar, you need to go and buy a series of law books that you won't be able to find unless an old lawyer has died, because they just don't print them anymore. There is no electronic version of the laws or the regulations or different statutes on the books. So there's a lot of challenge in terms of strengthening a nation state post their decision in the case of Myanmar to start down the path of democracy. And often what happens is a lot of donor governments and also business and industry, we all pile into the state. We all pile in the hope that we're going to help them without realising what we're also doing is overwhelming the very people that we're attempting to assist. The other challenge for us too is having a look at how we can build capacity inside those nation states. The reality is, again, that we don't have the depth of talent inside a country to enable them to return democracy. Instead, what they do is they tend to then be over-reliant on outside organisations, and one of the easiest examples to look at is reliance on outside economists to try and tell you how you should be running your country without the economists really knowing what your country is all about. Again, Myanmar is a case in point. 70% of the population reside in agricultural areas, yet somehow we're now trying to turn that country into a manufacturing hub. Why are we trying to turn it into a manufacturing hub? Because apparently there's cheap labour. But it doesn't mean that the people, 70% of the population, have any skills around their ability to manufacture a good or a product. So it's all about retargeting the way that we think about entering a country to enable them or support them to self-sustainability. We tend to overthink how we should be doing things because we know better without realising what the local population needs. And in the case of business and industry, where we come in, is understanding what is possible in the short, medium and long term. You can only start having a look at effective development and effective aid if you know what the outcome is. And the only outcome that should be associated with development is to ensure that that economy and that people are empowered to self-governance and independence, a form of self-reliance where they're not always reliant on aid coming in to prop the economy up. So we're calling for, I'm suggesting that we need a bit of a paradigm shift when it comes to this sort of thing, where we have an aligned and integrated approach with civil society, the UN system, donor governments, and business and industry move as one and not move in isolation from one to the other. It's a really important point. It's also important that you understand that the role of business is not just to come in and get commercial gain or benefit. That will happen if the motivations are true and correct and the laws and regulations support it. But the role of the Global Compact is to ensure that the behaviour emitted by these companies is the best behaviour possible. And again, using Myanmar as an example, we were one of the first organisations into Myanmar in April last year. We have an outpost in Myanmar now supporting companies moving in, and we also get to monitor and evaluate their behaviour and performance against our pillars. I haven't got too long, have I? 2 minutes. The other thing I just wanted to quickly cover, which is another challenge, is understanding fundamentally, and this is lost in translation a lot. We tend to think that a government or a prime minister or an elected official sits at the middle of what we're trying to achieve. The truth is the citizen always sits at the middle of what we need to be looking at in terms of returning a country to self-reliance. Around the central pillar are, of course, the local institutions, central government, local business and local NGOs. And then the fourth pillar are business, NGOs, the UN system, organisations like the World Bank. So you've got to understand that if we don't have the citizen sitting at the very centre of what it is that we're promoting or producing in terms of development and aid, then we're going to get it fundamentally wrong. It's also where ultimately things like corruption start creeping in, and the fact that holes can be poked in the very governance structures that we're meant to be building. And I've already talked about Myanmar, so I won't in the time left that I've got. But I also wanted to just cover by the numbers. $133 billion in foreign aid has been given since 2011. Over the last 50 years, developed countries have given as much as $2.3 trillion, and yet we still have the same issues. What we have is a discoordinated approach to the delivery of development assistance into a country. And two examples, one is Papua New Guinea and the other one is Haiti. After the natural disasters in Haiti, there was an absolute inundation of individual companies and organisations, NGOs and civil society organisations rushing in to help the Haitian people. There was no doubt that the motivation was absolutely true and fair, but the reality is, as soon as that happened, the systems and the infrastructure was overwhelmed. In terms of Papua New Guinea, we've been overwhelming the infrastructure for a very long time, and the billions of dollars that have been pouring in haven't exactly helped in returning that country to a formidable, sustainable economy. So what I'm suggesting, as I said before, that if we have a look at institution strengthening, if we have a look at the targeted delivery of development aid and assistance, and also have a look at the targeted delivery of assistance and investment support from business and industry in a coordinated approach, then the very things that Chris has been talking about, that are talked about in the post-2015 agenda, I dare say through collective impact can be achieved a lot sooner and a lot faster. I just want to leave you with a quick quote from, of all people, Melinda Gates. Melinda Gates, Bill Gates' wife of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I would say that she knew more about Microsoft than he did, but that's just my interpretation. She said, "We believe the world changes when the boldest thinking is directed at the toughest problems." We tend to, in the game that I operate in anyway, we tend to leave the too hard basket alone and think that the old conventional ways and means of approaching a problem are what we should be doing today. Well, the world is vastly different than 20 years ago, than 10 years ago, dare I say even 5 years ago. And so the very institutions that we need to be strengthening, we also need to have a look at reforming if we're truly to meet the outcomes of the 2015 agenda. Finally, I just wanted to say, because somebody mentioned about young people this morning, I'm 39 tomorrow. I think I live in between, thank you. My wife is going to kill me when I get home because I didn't tell her I was coming to Canberra today and I'm off overseas tomorrow, so I'm in a bit of trouble. But I want to say this. Young people are absolutely, obviously, the key to our future. And any of the young people that are in here tomorrow, I would fully advocate getting involved in this agenda and being passionate about the role that the UN system can and does play. We've lost sight of all the very good work the United Nations does around the world, from humanitarian aid and development and assistance, the work of Chris and his small team here at UNIC out of Canberra, and any number of delivery agencies. They do make a real impact. And they need young people to kick into gear and start getting out there and pulling the name of the UN system sometimes out of the too hard folder that some governments tend to put it in. But don't lose sight of those who are 20 years older than me or so, a little bit maturer than I, maybe with a few more grey hairs than I have. Because in that core group of people, as is evidenced by today, is an immense amount of corporate knowledge and experience. So my message is, yes, advocate for young people to be more engaged and more involved, but not forgetting the very hard work, intelligence and corporate knowledge of the older generation. And I think we have a much more powerful team if those two groups come together somewhere in the middle. Thank you.